So as we know, Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers, and then he rises to power. The brothers don't know. Long story short, 22 years later, he says, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? And he reveals his identity. And then there's this scene in this very emotional meeting. And if it's emotional with all the brothers, it's even more emotional with Joseph and his brother Benjamin. Binyamin is the only brother who shares the same mother, right? Because both Joseph and Benjamin were the two sons of Rachel, Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite wife. And of all the brothers, if you're Joseph, the only brother that didn't try to sell you as a slave, maybe was Benjamin. So obviously, it's a very emotional reunion between Benjamin and Joseph. And the Torah describes that scene. And it talks about how they cried. And then we're also going to look later what happens when Joseph is reunited with his father, Jacob. They're also crying. There's a lot of crying in this portion. By the way, the person who cries the most in the Bible is Joseph. Last week he cried, I think, 3 times. Then he cries in this parsha. Joseph is always crying. Almost nobody cries in the Bible. Jacob cries when he meets Rachel. I believe Jacob and Esav cry when they reunite, but nobody's crying as much as Joseph. So what this talk is going to think about you want to think about what is this idea of what is the idea of the reunion? You'll see that it says when they fell on each other and hugged each other, it keeps referring to the neck. They fell on each other's necks, and there's a medrash on that, and we're going to elaborate on that medrash. And we're also going to think about the crying. What's the deal with the crying? So that's the introduction. We'll jump right in. No time to waste. Go ahead.
I ask?
Sure.
The crying, is it a sign of emotional strength? Because sometimes it is considered a sign of weakness, but I think it's emotional strength most.
Yes. It is. We'll talk about when to cry, when not to cry. Joseph himself, he cries many times. But interestingly, the Rebbe doesn't talk about this in this talk, but interestingly, Joseph never cries when you would expect him to cry, right? When would you expect him to cry? When he's on the way down, when his brothers throw him into the pit, when his brothers sell him as a slave, when he's accused of raping his mistress, and he's thrown into prison, when he's forgotten in prison. You would think that's when he cries. Joseph is never crying there. Joseph cries when he rose to power and he reunited with his brothers. So it's very interesting to think about that. The Rebbe doesn't talk about it directly, but we may get insight into that indirectly about when he cries and also when he doesn't cry. And then we'll think about what is he crying about or what is he not crying about. So we're looking at the verse, but we're also looking at the medrash, the medrashic commentary on the verse, and we're going to try to shed some light on the medrash's commentary. Okay, so we'll jump right in. We'll see what happens. So these are the Rebbe's words with the bold is on the English, and then you have Hebrew on this side. So why the neck? On the verse, and he fell on the neck of Binyamin, his brother, and wept, and Binyamin wept on his neck. That's the verse. That's the verse describing the emotional reunion between Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph and Benjamin.
Share the link?
I'm sorry?
Can you share the link?
Yes. There you go.
Thank you.
So the verse says they cried on each other's neck. So the Talmud gives an interesting interpretation. The Talmud says, the sages comment in the Talmud, and they say as follows. They say, very unusual commentary. You would think, why are they crying? Because they're emotional. They met each other. The two brothers haven't seen each other in 22 years, so why shouldn't they cry? But the Talmud says, no. In addition to the straightforward interpretation that it's just an emotional scene, there's also a spiritual connection. They're also crying about the temples. How do you get to that? We'll see. So the Talmud says as follows. Yosef cried for the two Batei HaMikdash, the two temples, as alluded to by the plural form of the word savare, translated as neck. In other words, if you think about it, the word savare could be read as necks in the plural. So a neck is a temple. We'll see later why. And necks is two temples. So there's two temples in the portion of Benjamin. The temple in Jerusalem was actually on the border between Judah and Benjamin, Yehuda and Binyamin. That's where the temple was. So the Talmud says, when Joseph cries over their quote unquote necks, even though you could translate it as neck, it could be neck. It could be tzavare, could be the neck of, or it could be necks. So obviously the pshat, the simple meaning, it's the neck of. The yud at the end makes it the neck of. But on the other hand, it could be read, if you look at that verse independently, it could be read the necks in the plural. So the Talmud says that Joseph cries because of the two necks, which represented two temples that were in the portion of Benjamin and later destroyed. Binyamin wept for the sanctuary of Shiloh that would be built in the tribal portion of Joseph and later destroyed. So Benjamin cries over Joseph's neck. Joseph also has a neck. Where's Joseph's neck? Where was the temple in Joseph's portion? So we know that before the temple was built in Jerusalem, there was a period of time, a very lengthy period of time, 369 years that the temple stood in a city called Shiloh, which was in the portion of Joseph. So that's what the Talmud says. Talmud says, make no mistake, when they're meeting each other and they're crying, they're not only crying physically because of their emotional reunion, but they're also thinking about historically. And if they're crying, it's because there's a certain level of destruction that's going to befall Joseph. Temple of Shiloh will be destroyed. And then Joseph cries for Benjamin, the two necks, the two temples that are going to be destined to be in Benjamin's section and be destroyed. So that's what the Talmud says. Okay, the Talmud doesn't give you much interpretation, but now we're going to apply this concept from somewhere else in the Talmud. And the first question we want to figure out is, why is the temple alluded to in the neck? That's the first question we want to have. So we have to look at a different medrash. This medrash is a different medrash based on the verse in the Song of Songs that describes the temple as a neck and explains why the temple should be the neck. I would argue that the temple should be the head, because the head is the most elevated part of the person. And I would assume that the temple is the most spiritual part of the world. That's what we say in a sense. The temple is the most spiritual part of the world. So if you're going to say that, if you want a metaphor within the human body to referring to the temple, I would expect it to be the head is the temple. Instead, it says the neck is the temple. So we want to deal with that. And to do that, we have to look at the Medrash. And I don't think the Medrash is going to give us the full interpretation. I think we're going to add interpretation over the Medrash, if I remember correctly. So here we go. The Medrash explains why the neck is used as an analogy for the Beit HaMikdash, for the temple. When interpreting the verse, your neck is like the Tower of David. So this is in the Song of Songs. When the man is praising the woman and talking about her beautiful neck. So he says, your neck is like the Tower of David. Says the Medrash that is a reference to the temple. So God is praising the Jewish people about the beauty of the temple. And he uses the metaphor of a neck. Why a neck? Says the Medrash, just as the neck is at the high point of a person's body, so too the Beit HaMikdash is located at the high point of the world. I don't know if it's the tallest mountain in the world, and the temple, it's not. But in that region, Temple Mountain is the tallest spot, almost the tallest spot. As we explain, the expression at the high point of the world is not, however, to be interpreted literally. For, as our sages comment on the verse, he shall dwell between his shoulders. The Beis HaMikdash is 23 cubits lower than the spring of Etam. Just as a person's neck through a high point, though at a high point on his body, is lower than his head. On the contrary, when King David and Samuel the prophet were seeking to determine the location of the Beit HaMikdash, they said, "Let us lower its site a drop, for it is written, he shall dwell between his shoulders. There is no more attractive portion of an ox than the place between his shoulders." According to this interpretation, at the high point of the world means among the higher points of the world. What's happening here? So we have three different medrashim. We have the Talmud that says that when Joseph cries on Benjamin's shoulders and when Benjamin cries on Joseph's shoulders, that they're crying really about the temples that are going to be destroyed in the future. Why? What does temple have to do with the neck? So we look at the other Talmud, that's the Medrash that says that in the Song of Songs, when the man praises the woman and says that your neck is like the Tower of David, that refers to the temple. Why the temple? Why the neck? Because the neck is in the high point of the body. So too, the temple was in the high point of that region. But then we have another interpretation. In Joseph's, when Moses blesses the tribes at the end of his life, so he talks about the tribe of Joseph, and he says, "Bank tefav shachen," God should dwell between between the shoulders. Again, a reference to the neck. And there the Talmud says, oh, when the Jewish people, when King David was going to choose the place for the temple, they decided, don't make it the highest point of the region, make it a little lower, 23 cubits lower than the highest point, because this is a quote, the most beautiful part of the ox is the shoulders. I have no idea why that is. I don't know why that is, but that's what the Medrash says. Again, because in the metaphor, in the blessing of Moses to Joseph, he talks about Joseph as a beautiful ox, beautiful ox with beautiful horns. And then at the end of that phrase, he says, and God dwells between his shoulders. So at the ox, the most beautiful part of the ox is between the shoulders. Therefore, the temple is not at the highest point. It's a little lower. So this whole paragraph tells us that the temple is referred to the shoulder. Why? Because it's not at the highest point. It's a little lower. Okay, but what is the spiritual meaning of that? Why is the temple indeed not at the highest point? And why is it a little bit lower? And most important, of course, what does it have to do with us? The fact that Benjamin cried for Joseph and Joseph cried for Benjamin because they're crying over the temple and the temple is the shoulder. This is all nice information. But what does it have to do with us? So that's what we have to continue to explore. So on the surface, the Rebbe asks a question. On the surface, the above requires an explanation. Why is not being at the highest point considered a positive virtue and attractive? If there is no advantage in height, why do our sages teach that the Beit HaMikdash is located at the high point of the world? And if height is a virtue, as implied by our sages' statements, seemingly whatever is higher is more attractive and of greater virtue. Why then is lower than the stream of Eitam, which was the highest place? In other words, you have to pick your choice. If you have to decide, if height is a virtue, the temple should be at the highest point, not at the neck. And if height is not a virtue, so why are you praising the temple by saying, wow, it's so high, it's like the neck? So this forces us to go a little bit deeper. And that's what we're going to explain. Let's look at the neck and see what the function of the neck is. And then we'll understand that the temple also serves more than the head, more than the spiritual head of the Jewish people. The temple is the spiritual neck of the Jewish people. And in some ways, the neck is more important than the head. I hate to say it that way because without a head, you can't do much. But the neck is very important. So let's see. Let's read. The above questions can be resolved by explaining the function of the neck, which serves as a point of transition between the head and the body. A person's collective life energy rests in the brain and is transmitted to the body through the medium of the esophagus, trachea, and veins in the throat. A similar pattern is found with regard to the transmission of the power of thought. The external dimension of the power of thought is drawn down from the brain to the heart, and from there its influence is spread throughout the entire body. This comes through the medium of the throat, a narrow organ that is interposed between them. Thus, the neck possesses a certain advantage over even the head, for it is the neck and throat that make it possible for the head's purpose to be carried out, enabling. What is the two things the neck does? All the limbs to receive their life energy from the head, and B, all of them to conduct themselves according to the power of thought lodged in the head. So what are we saying? We're saying, let's read one paragraph. When the head and neck are considered independently, the head possesses an advantage over the neck. Therefore, even in a physical sense, it is higher than it. This advantage, however, applies only to the order within a person's internal hierarchy. When speaking about the ultimate purpose and mission of the head, there is an advantage to the neck precisely because it is lower. Being lower enables it to serve as a point of transition and enables it to transmit vitality and the power of thought from the head to the body. It's a very interesting analogy. What's greater, the head or the neck, or the head of any other part of the body? Of course, the head is the most important limb of the body. Okay, but what's the purpose of the head? The purpose of the head is, amongst other things, to lead the rest of the body, to influence the rest of the body. In that, if you're focused on the purpose, if that's the focus, the purpose, then the neck is more important because the head can have all the strength and all the vitality, but God forbid a person with a stroke, stroke is not a perfect example, but if there's a blockage between the brain and the rest of the limbs, then the brain is not going to be able to influence the limbs. And in that sense, the metaphor of the neck serves as the passage through which the brain influences the rest of the body. And now we're going to go back to the temple. Spiritually speaking, the temple is more than the neck More than the head, the temple is more closely related to the neck, even though it probably has an element of the head as well. So let's see why the temple is the neck. Similar concepts apply with regard to the Beit HaMikdash, which is described with the analogy of a neck. Its primary advantage is its slight descent from the foremost peak. For the purpose of the Beit HaMikdash is to serve as a medium through which godly light is drawn down to illuminate the world, even those elements of existence on the lower levels. Therefore, the Beit HaMikdash was located on a high point, but not on the highest point. It was not elevated entirely from the world. Were that so, it would have been too lofty and could not have served as a medium to illuminate the world. It was therefore necessary to lower its site to a drop, to bring it closer to and into connection with the world so that it could illuminate it. This resembles a person's neck, which, because it is lower than the elevated station of the head and closer to the body, is able to serve as a point of transition between the two and join them together. So what are we saying here? We're saying, if you want to think about the temple as a holy place, right? In many cultures, the temple is a sanctuary. It's the holy place, the holiest place on earth. That's where you retreat to connect to spirituality. If that's your idea of what the function and mission of a temple is, then the metaphor for the temple should be a head, because the head is the most lofty part of the body. But that's not why we have a temple. The purpose of the temple is not to have a place of spirituality. That's not why we have a temple. That's not why we go to a temple. The purpose of the temple is to be able to bring the holiness of God to the rest of the world. The purpose of the temple is to inspire us to bring the inspiration and of the holiness to, and bring that to the rest of the world, to illuminate the rest of the world. And because that is the function of the temple, and that's the symbolism of the temple, therefore, if you want a metaphor for the temple, you're not going to say the head, which is lofty and removed. You're going to use the metaphor of a neck, which is really the connector between the holy and the mundane, between the head and the rest of the body. Because our idea of what the temple is supposed to achieve is different than the conventional notion of what a temple is, a place to retreat, a place to separate, a place to run away from the world. No, the purpose of a temple, you go there to find holiness and to find inspiration, but the purpose then is to bring that holiness to the rest of the world. So that is, go ahead.
So this is like Chabad would be the brain, the head, and then it's being brought down to either the emotions or the actions.
Right. So in some sense of the Chabad is wisdom, understanding, knowledge. In some sense, we'll talk about this on Friday, the most important of the three intellectual capacities in some sense is da'at, of knowledge. Knowledge is the bridge that connects the mind to the emotions. So, and it also functions. So within the mind, there has to be the bridge, but there's also the neck. And there's a very interesting Kabbalistic interpretation that the word for Pharaoh.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah.
Pharaoh is, if you move the letters, is ha'oref, which is the nape, the back of the neck. So what's Pharaoh? And by the way, the word Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. What is Egypt? Egypt is straits. Straits is the narrow spot. So there is a narrowing between the brain, between the mind and the heart, because that flow has to be narrowed. Why that is another story. It has to be narrowed because the brain's full understanding, it cannot go to the heart because the heart doesn't speak that language. So it has to create some level of tzimtzum, contraction, and only a part of the awareness of the mind can go to the heart. And the danger of that process is that in that neck, there's also straits. And in that straits, there's also the opposition. And the opposition is the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tries to block what we understand from what we feel. More often than not, when we do something that we ourselves know is wrong and we're not happy, when we do something that we're not happy with at the end of the day, it's not like we didn't know that, we didn't understand that this behavior is destructive. That wasn't the problem. More often than not, the problem is but more often than not, the problem is not in the intellectual capacity to analyze and understand. What is the problem often is that our awareness of the mind doesn't influence our heart. So even though I know this is not good for me in my mind, it doesn't influence my heart. My heart still wants it. even though I know in my mind that this is good for me, but my heart is not motivated. So we're not really talking, so that's the challenge of Egypt. So we're gonna have to deal with Egypt later. In the next portions, we'll talk about the Pharaoh and how do you fight the Pharaoh. But the Pharaoh, it's interesting, his letters, Pharaoh is ha'oref. If you change the order, it's the nape, because it's standing there trying to obstruct the flow from the mind to the heart. And the temple is, later on we'll see what's a temple within each person, but the temple represents the capacity to connect the rest of the world. It's the place where you connect the rest of the world to God. So it's interesting because sometimes we refer to the temple as the holiest place of the world, which is true in some sense, but that's not the point we're emphasizing here. The point we're emphasizing here is that if you want to talk about the most holy place, that's the neck. But if you want, that's the head. But if you want to talk about the purpose of the head, for the purpose of the head is to influence the body, then in that sense, the neck is more important in some ways. Even though you can't really say, because the neck without a head is nothing. But the point is, what element are we highlighting? So we're highlighting the element of the connecting, the interface between the physical and the spiritual, and that is what the neck is supposed to do, and that's what the neck symbolizes. And in a moment, we'll talk about the neck within each person, and then we'll also have to talk a little bit about the crying, because that's what we advertised. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I don't know, maybe Rebbe will be talking about it later, but it's not only about the neck, it's the emotion that originates, that triggers that crying. So they crying over distraction. And based on the pattern that you described at the beginning, most of the time Joseph cries tears of joy, of relief.
Right.
So that will be like mostly tears of relief, but at the same time, you're saying that they cry over distraction. So how that
we'll get to that. But I do want to say, I will get to that, but I do want to say that your first point, that the crying is the emotion, I agree with that. But the question is, so they're certainly, they have the neck, right? Their mind is connected to their heart. So you're crying in this sense, as you will see, their crying was a healthy crying. Some crying is unhealthy, but their crying is healthy, as you will see. But what are they crying over, right? So here they're saying, it doesn't say they cried on their head. Could have been said they hug each other crying on their head. It could have said that. It doesn't say, it says their neck. And the Medrash has this whole thing, and the Talmud has this whole thing, the neck in the singular, neck in the plural. So, because it's the temple. Oh, so this is an interesting concept. If you asked me, if I haven't studied this talk, and you ask me if I know nothing, if I haven't seen the Medrash, and you say, what do you think the Medrash would compare to the what do you think, which part of the body would the Medrash compare the temple to? I would say, oh, temple is the head, of course. Right? Here the Talmud says, oh, the temple is the neck. That is surprising. So if it's surprising, it's because there's an inner reason. What's the inner reason? The inner reason is the temple is less interested in the state of abstract spirituality. It's not why we have a temple. The temple is here to inspire us so that we can go home and bring that holiness to the rest of the world. If that's what the temple is about, if that's the function and purpose of the temple, so then the better metaphor would be the metaphor of the neck. Because again, in our life, what's more important, to have good ideas or to have a neck where your ideas can influence your heart? Right? I can have wonderful ideas, but if it doesn't trigger my emotion, it's not gonna get off the ground, because the motivation comes from the heart. If you're not going to get the heart on board, there'll be no motivation. So I have an idea, but the idea is not going to cause me to move. So within a person, as we're going to talk about this in a second, within a person, in some sense, more than a healthy head is a healthy neck. So let's talk about that. Let's read.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this is an extremely different interpretation of when Esav falls on Yaakov's neck.
Yeah. So you can read that in both ways. You can read it in both ways. You can read it, the Rebbe doesn't talk about that. But if I had to guess, you could talk about because that also could be read positively and negatively. The Medrash reads it negatively. He tried to bite his neck. The bottom line is, if you read it positive or negative, the conflict or the resolution of the conflict was in the realm of the head, was the realm of the neck, right? They weren't in other words, you could read it that Esav was trying to block the flow from Jacob's head to the rest of the body. In other words, they understood, however you read it, positive or negative, the most important part would be the neck, because what matters to the Jew for the Jew's mission, the neck is more important than the head. It's not about having great ideas. It's that too, but that's not what we're trying to achieve. We're trying that those ideas should influence the rest of the world, or within ourselves, that those ideas should influence our emotion. Because the mind is wonderful, but it's abstract. Just knowing something is not going to influence the rest of the body. If I feel it, if I'm motivated, then it's going to get my feet to move, and it's going to get my hands to move. Oh, so let's finish this final piece. The same is true regarding the Beit HaMikdash in microcosm that exists within every Jew, which is his godly soul. When a person's soul is not uplifted and exalted to the point of separation from his own private world, but instead is involved and clothed itself within it, enabling him to refine his animal soul, body, and portion of the world, his entire existence becomes a sanctuary for God's light. In other words, the temple, very interesting the way the wording, if you read it carefully, you see, I think this is what I see at least. If you read it carefully, you see that the godly soul is the temple. The godly soul is the temple. Now, godly soul could be either a head or a neck, right? It depends. If your godly soul is separate and removed from the rest of your personality, then wonderful, then you have a beautiful head. But if in addition to because it's the most spiritual and elevated part of self, most transcendent part of self, but if it's separate from the rest of my identity, then I have a healthy head, but there's no neck. If I want a temple in my life, if I want a temple in my life, what has to happen is that the perspective of the godly soul, the holiness of the godly soul, has to lower itself down and serve as a bridge and inspire all parts of my personality, all parts of my body, and also even my portion in the world. That's when I have a temple. So the temple is alluded to in the neck. If I don't have a neck, if my godly soul is separate from the body, in other words, it's abstract, then I have a wonderful head, but that's not a temple. I only become a temple if there's a connection between the holy spark within me and the rest of my body, which is very interesting. It means the head can never get destroyed. Well, we'll talk about this later. There's destruction, right? Soon they're going to cry for the destruction. So there's destruction. What does it mean that a person's spiritual temple is destroyed? It means that somehow or another, the holiness that's at the core of his being does not spread to the rest of his personality, right? But the head is always there. That's the beauty of the metaphor. The beauty of the metaphor is, even when the temple is destroyed, there's holiness in the world. The problem is the holiness is not connected to the rest of the world. That's in the world collectively. Within the microcosm, which is the human being, is the same story. When I look at a person and say, oh, this person's spiritual temple is destroyed, what does that mean? Does it mean he has no holiness? Of course he has holiness. The head is always intact. The destruction of the temple does not affect the head. Destruction of a temple means the function of the neck is obscured. And to rebuild the temple would be to rebuild the neck. But the point is, what that really says is that the optimism that the head is always there. There's always a place within the human soul that is pure and holy and removed. The problem is that sometimes it's too removed. And then it takes effort to create the connector, and the connector is the neck. And sometimes the neck is not connected. And what do you do then? If your friend's neck is broken, is destroyed, then you have to cry. Why is crying the option? We'll get to that in a minute. We're not going to have to, I don't think we'll have time to read everything inside, but I'll set it up and read one or two paragraphs. And very, very powerful. And I heard this was said, that Rebbe taught this in 1964. My uncle was actually there. He was at the talk, and he says when the Rebbe spoke this, it made a very great impression on people. The Rebbe was very emotional when he talked about this. So we'll read maybe at least a paragraph or two, maybe more. I don't want to go the whole morning, but the bottom line is, even this in itself, we already put out a full idea, right? We already put out a full idea. Forget about the crying. Let's think about the neck. Like I said, seemingly, the metaphor for the temple, the befitting metaphor would be the head. And here we say, no, it's not the head, it's the neck. Why? Because yes, you can have a head. Yes, there's always holiness in the world. Yes, every person always has the godly soul within their head, within their most sublime and highest part of their personality. That's a given. The question is, are we going to have a temple? And what does a temple mean? A temple means, could I connect that holiness, that inspiration, to the rest of my personality, to the rest of my day, right? We think about going to the temple as, let's say, going to the shul to daven. That's not a temple. If you're going to the shul to daven, that's the head, right? You're going to a secluded place to go pray. It becomes a temple if you can take that inspiration from the temple and bring it to the rest of your day. Then you move from the realm of head and you moved into the realm of neck.
Yeah, this is so beautiful, and also explains the idea of healthy crying, because it's very optimistic message.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
So maybe tears of relief too, because you know that the holiness is still there.
Right. So that's the paradox. The Rebbe doesn't talk. The Rebbe is just going to talk about the negative crying. We'll get to that in a second. But there's a paradox here. They're crying over the neck. You could say they're crying. The Talmud says they're crying over the neck that will be destroyed. That is if you look at it with tears of sadness. But it's also, you could say, implied in that is tears of joy, because they're sad that the neck is destroyed, and they're happy that the neck existed for so many years. Right?
And they're still intact.
Yeah, it's still intact. And it's a very beautiful concept that Rebbe doesn't talk about it here, but it's a very interesting concept that if you think about it, it says that the second temple was destroyed because of the infighting between the Jewish people. Sinat chinam, senseless hatred. Where does all the hate between the Jewish people begin? The brothers sell Joseph. When the brothers unite, when Joseph reveals his identity and the brothers are united, the first thing that you hear about is the temple. They're crying over the neck. The temple is back. Why is the temple back? Because the way to create a temple is you have to have the unity of the people. If there's separation between the people, there's no temple. So that's very interesting how all of a sudden, as soon as you see the unity, the temple is back, because the antithesis to the temple is the infighting, is the separation between the Jewish people, which, as we said, really begins with the separation between Joseph and his brothers. Okay, let's think a little bit about crying, and we'll read a paragraph or two inside. What is crying good or bad? Okay, so crying psychologically is very good, because what it does is it's a relief. It's a relief. A person cannot contain the pain, and you cry. And the reality is, when you cry, you feel better. Now, the question is that a good thing? Is it good to let out the pain, to release yourself of the pain? Is that a good thing to do? And the answer is, it depends. So long as there's something that you can do practically, don't cry. Crying will be a distraction. There's a beautiful teaching of the previous Rebbe quoted in the Rebbe has a book called Hayom Yom, Day to Day. It's basically a diary that every day has a Hasidic saying for that day. So one of them says, one action is better than 1,000, how do you say it in English? Krecht. Krecht is like to sigh. One action is better than 1,000 sighs. In other words, I'm going to cry. I feel bad. I'm going to relieve my pain. Is that good? Maybe I shouldn't relieve the pain. As long as I can do something, I don't cry. When I did everything I could, then I cry. Because then I can release the pain. Nothing else you can do. And here, what the Rebbe says is like this. The Rebbe is going to say, your own temple, you never cry over your own temple. Right? The problem is, how come Joseph cries for Benjamin and Benjamin cries for Joseph? How come Joseph doesn't cry for Joseph and Benjamin cry for Benjamin? The answer is you never cry over your own temple. Why? Because you can always help yourself. Spiritually speaking, I can always do an action. When it comes to somebody else, I can try, I can help, but ultimately it's not in my power. Ultimately, it's the other person's decision whether he wants to rebuild his spiritual temple. So for your friend, after you did everything you could, you can cry. But for yourself, what are you crying? Do something. And that's why Joseph doesn't cry. Now, we don't have time to do the whole thing inside, but when Jacob meets Joseph, it says that Joseph cries, Jacob doesn't cry. Why doesn't Jacob cry? The Medrash says he's saying Shema, but that's another story. We're not going to get into that right now. But the bottom line is, what the Rebbe is going to say, it's Jacob represents the collective Jewish people. So for Jacob, all the temples are his temples. So he's never crying. So that's the talk. We'll read it inside. But going back to the picture, which the Rebbe doesn't talk about, we're going back, where does Joseph cry? If you think about it, whenever he can do something, he doesn't cry. When he cries, everything is sort of turning the corner. Things are becoming positive. He already did what he could. The plan is in motion. That's when he allows the pain he cries to allow the pain to release some of the pain. But in the midst of the struggle, you don't cry in the midst of the struggle, because that's a relief. And a relief is the distraction, because the struggle should motivate you to do, not to cry. So let's read it inside. That addition is that the Rebbe doesn't say. That's just adding some salt and pepper. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what it is. Let's read. Okay, I'm going to skip number 3 if you want. I'm going to skip section. What section is this? This is section 2. I'm going to skip section 2 and skip section 3. I'm going to section 4. And the basically questions were, there were a few questions. One of the questions were, why is each one crying over the other person? So so I said it before, we'll read it inside. These concepts can be explained as follows. Regarding worldly matters, why does someone cry? To release tension and make himself feel better. As we see in actual life, when a person cries over a difficult and aggravating matter, the crying has no power to rectify the circumstances that prompted it. However, as reflected by the verse, my tears were like bread for me. King David says, Haita li dimati lechem. Your tears are like bread, because the tears offer comfort, just like bread offers comfort. So in other words, when you cry, it's not going to help anything. Crying doesn't help in the objective sense. It helps in the sense that it makes you feel better. Crying makes the person feel better. This leads to the conclusion that when a person has the potential to correct a matter, he should do what he can do to correct it rather than calm himself by crying. When a person sees the destruction of a colleague's Beit HaMikdash, a colleague's spiritual temple, he shares their pain and cries. However, the fundamental correction of the problem and the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash is not dependent on him, but on his colleague. He can, and indeed he is obligated to help his colleague by reproving him in a pleasant manner, arousing divine mercy and praying for him. In other words, yes, you could try to help your friend, that's for sure. Nevertheless, actually negating the sins that caused the destruction of the colleague's temple, Beit HaMikdash, is dependent on his colleague. And that colleague has free choice. In other words, there's only a limited thing that you can do. You can help, you can pray, you can try to influence, but ultimately your colleague has free choice. They can decide whether they want to rebuild their own temple. Therefore, when a person has done everything he can to help his colleague and sees that his colleague's Beit HaMikdash remains destroyed, his soul will be impacted and he will cry. All this refers to one's relations with others. When by contrast, a person sees that his own Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed, he cannot content himself with sighing and weeping. On the contrary, he must try to correct the situation and build anew by performing his divine service in a manner that brings about an individual experience of redemption within his own soul. So sometimes the Rebbe is going to qualify, sometimes crying is actually part of repentance. But if not, sometimes, by contrast, ordinary weeping can at times weaken one's efforts to rebuild his own Beit HaMikdash, for he will think that he has already fulfilled this obligation by weeping. Oh, I did something wrong. Oh, I cried. Oh, I'm spiritually sensitive, and I'm satisfied by the crying. And then he continues, accordingly, both Yosef and Binyamin wept over the sanctuary that was in the other's portion. Yaakov, however, did not weep about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but instead recited the Shema. Yaakov is the father of the entire Jewish people, and thus both the sanctuary of Shiloh and the Beit HaMikdash were, quote unquote, in his portion, i.e. relevant to him. Accordingly, by reciting the Shema, he was involved in correcting and rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash. So that is the story in short. A little bit more to say, but you have the link. You have the link. You could look at it. You could look at the entire talk. But I think this is the main concepts. The main concept is that it refocuses of our attention. What are we trying to build in our life? More than a head, more than the temple. You don't have to build the head. The head is always intact. The building, or consequently the destruction of the temple, all hinges upon the neck. Are my ideas, my awareness that I have in my mind, which is always going to be positive because I always have the godly soul. If I don't see it because I'm not going high enough within my personality, there's always the highest point within myself. There's always the godly soul, which is transcendent and positive and full of positive energy. The question becomes, do I have a neck? Can I connect that part of myself to the rest of my personality? If I could, I have a temple. If not, I have a destroyed temple. If I have a destroyed temple, my friend can try to help me, And if they try to help me and they can't help me, they can cry because they feel bad. But for me, I can never cry, or most times I should say, not never. Never say never. The talk was qualified. Sometimes the crying itself is part of the repentance, but on a regular basis, crying is not going to solve the problem. You say, "Oh, I'm so bad. Oh, I hate to be political, but it's almost like the victim mentality. You say, "Oh, I've been hurt. I'm in a terrible situation. There's nothing I can do." That's the danger of crying. The danger of crying means it releases me from the responsibility to act. And that's what, like the Rebbe said then, it's not in the talk is edited, but the way that Rebbe said it, he says, why are you crying? Go do something, right? And in that sense, it puts the emphasis on the action. What are we going to do to rebuild the temple, to connect the holy and spiritual part of ourselves, the positive part of ourselves, with the entire personality via the neck? So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. Thank you very much for joining. And you should have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Rabbi, in terms of buying a Sfarim for Hey Tevet, is there something, I mean, frequently when I look at it, it's nothing I can understand. So is there something that's easy to understand that you'd recommend?
That's a good question. The book that we're reading from is actually probably the easiest of, I don't know if the easiest, but it's from the Rebbe's talks. That's relatively accessible. Then there are other books that if you want, in other words, the question is if you want Hebrew or English or adaptions or the original. So that all depends. There's a beautiful series called, let me see what's going on over here. So if you want this book that we were reading, on the page, there's a link to buy the book, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Right. So on the page is a link to buy the book.
Okay.
I'll share it. Copy. They so far have 2 books in the series. They're putting out a 3rd one for Vayikra. They have Genesis and Exodus. There's 3 talks per week, 3 essays per week. Then there's all kinds of either original content or adaptions. The Inside Story.
Is one of your books is one of them? Your book that you wrote is one of them?
No, it's not ready to go yet. Inside Story.
And is Hayom Yom, is that easy to understand or no?
Yeah, some are this footnotes. Yeah, some are. Yeah, most of them are. Yeah, most of them are. I'm just trying to show you what. There's a very good series by one of my favorite people who write on Chabad.org, Yankee Tauber. They call it The Inside Story. So it's essays that he rewrote both based on the Rebbe's talks, but they're very good. Here is a link to that. Here's a link to that, Inside Story, Meaningful Life. And then the right way to do this, let me go through Kahat and see what I think is good. So let me I guess for now I'm just going to stop the recording.